Awesome. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer Lehman from Mission Advancement, and who will take it away now.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. I'm going to share my screen. And okay, here we go. Chelsea, everything look good? Okay,
looks great.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to talk to you guys. I've been to your offices before. They're in Austin, obviously more than a year ago, but love your organization and what you guys are doing in the community. I'll talk a little bit more about mission advancement at the end if we have time. This is certainly not a sales presentation of any kind. This is just part of our education offering that we do with partner organizations like yours, as well as through our own kind of series of webinars and workshops throughout the year. So this is a topic that I absolutely love. So I'm excited that you guys were interested in it. We've been teaching this topic for a long time, but I think in the last 12 months, this has become a much hotter topic than ever before. And so I'm very hopeful and optimistic that you will get a nugget or two out of this today that will be applicable to your organization, regardless of size, regardless of mission, regardless of how sophisticated of a development operation you may be a part of. So you will get the slides, as Chelsea said, but I'm happy to answer questions along the way. So please, keep it casual and let her know if there's anything I need to clarify, and she can flag me down as we go as well. So the presentation is really divided into three big sections. The first section is just kind of the why of, first of all, what is a strategic development plan and why is this a concept that we recommend to every development office? So it'll be kind of foundational and philosophical for the first few slides. Then I'm going to talk in more detail about what we believe are the key components of a strategic development plan, regardless of the size of your organization. And then we're going to take a little break for Q&A at that point, and then I'll finish up with some practical applications and next steps, things that might be helpful just to think about what you can do this week, what you can do next month, and how you can actually get started into a process like this. So, first of all, what is the plan and why do we recommend it? So it's just like a regular strategic plan. We all talk about this all the time in our organizations, but we like to say this is a strategic plan for your other mission. And I know that's going to sound a little counterintuitive. I'll get back to that in just a second, what I mean by your other mission. But it's very similar to how we think about planning the broader scope of our organizations, how we serve people or whatever our mission may be. But this is going to be very strategically focused on development. So why is this an important process? So first of all, it's going to help you understand, I think in a better way, a more likely path to success. Our budgets are wonderful tools, and that tends to be where we put a lot of time and energy as development people. This is going to be a different way of kind of looking at your revenue, and is going to show you another way to kind of think about a path to success. It's going to help you measure progress differently throughout the year, differently than you may be accustomed to. This is the biggest one. This is, what we've all learned in 12 months is these risks that some of us mitigated very well, some really were challenged. The strategic development plan is going to show you how to overcome that. And this is by far the best takeaway from these plans. It's also going to help create stability during leadership turnover. This is something we see a lot, and our profession, unfortunately, has a pretty high turnover rate. And many times, a CEO brings in a new development person and says, hey, just do what you did at, XYZ organization. And this kind of brings a framework to, this is how our organization handles development. This is how we raise money. This is our strategy. So that when you do have turnover, you can bring people in and basically just teach them, how your plan works and how you want them to execute. It's a great way to engage your staff leadership and your board. And we'll talk a little bit about who should be involved in the process and how to do that. And then the last thing I said is because hope is not a strategy. And that's just one of a tagline we use all the time. And it just comes from working with a lot of organizations. Then we'll say, you know, how do you think you're going to get there? How do you think that's going to work? And the answer too many times being, well, we hope that this happens and we hope that that happens. And I'm a big believer in hope. So when it comes to raising money and development, I do believe there's a good framework that you can use that kind of mitigates some of that wishful thinking. Okay, so just to kind of make sure we're all talking the same language here, this is very basic development, but the strategic development plan is centered around your annual funding. So we're talking about the money that's tied to your operations, not your capital dollars, you know, not gift in kind, although that could be a component if you have a large gift in kind piece to your budget. But this is just your annual recurring needs. These are the dollars that are just vital to mission critical annual success of the organization. There's going to be measurable and impactful outcomes that happen as a result of these dollars. And the primary driver of success is going to be a relational approach. So you're going to see that loud and clear today, and I think the last 12 months, you know, I hope that some of you are in the category of organizations that have fared relatively well, given the circumstances. I know there's lots of answers to that question, but I would say the organizations that we've worked with that have done really well are the ones that are in relationship with donors. And it's the ones that have been way more transactional in their approach that have struggled the most to kind of connect with people during a crazy situation like this. So the driver of success in this strategic development plan is just going to give you the answer to the whole thing here is going to be building and maintaining relationships with segments of donors. So let's go back to the second mission concept. So who is your customer? Pretty simple question that businesses ask all the time. One of the key differences for many nonprofits, not all, some will not fit in this category, but most nonprofits, we would say have two distinct sets of customers. So if you think about a business owner in a for-profit entity like Subway sandwiches, you know, if I own a Subway franchise, my customer buys my sandwiches and they consume my sandwiches, right? So I basically have one ideal customer that I am targeting to buy and consume my product. In the nonprofit, we typically have our primary customer being those that we serve. So whether you're a pet rescue operation or a school or a human service organization or an arts organization, you are serving an audience. And that's that is what your strategic plan is probably all about, is how to serve more, greater, you know, bigger numbers, what larger population, wider geography, something like that. But there's also those who fund and support the mission. And many times these are not the same customer. That the people we serve, let's just go with people for this example, in a human service organization are probably not our donors, right? And so what we call kind of the second mission is the mission to those who fund the primary mission. And as a development person, you know this is what you do all day long, but most people in a nonprofit organization, what they think about all day long is the primary customer, as they should. You know, the program staff and many of the executive staff, that's why they're there. They're passionate about the cause, hopefully. And so for some people, donors are the necessary evil of a nonprofit. And we like to frame it as they are another customer that you as a development person, it is your job to take care of them all day, every day. And what is our strategy to that set of customers in our organization? So kind of a very foundational concept here that we recommend is just acknowledging and embracing that there is, in a sense, a second mission to serve that set of customers, which may look very different than your primary customer, but without whom our primary customer is not served. And so that's the concept of this plan being really centered around that second mission and looking at development and donors as a key component to the success of the primary mission. Okay, some additional foundational concepts. Board and staff, embracing that concept is a key component, that everybody agrees that donors are important and we need to serve them well and have a plan for how we generate revenue that we all agree on. The planning and reporting is something we're going to talk about as a donor-centric basis. And this is kind of a shift from budget. So instead of just looking at budget, year to date, every month, and looking at that as our kind of benchmark, I'm going to show you some tools and ways to look at progress based on a donor by donor mindset. And so we're going to stop worrying about where donors give in our budget, and we're going to be asking the question, are they still giving? So we didn't have events this year, right? And so our event budgets are all over the place. And how are we, correcting that, fixing that, counting that? And what I counsel my clients in is, it doesn't matter where the dollars go in your budget. It matters that you're taking care of the individual source and really determining, are we retaining them? Are they still engaged with us? Are they giving to us in a way that's meaningful for them? How we count it in our budget and, deal with it is kind of an internal challenge that we have to overcome. So when I say donor-centric, you're going to hear this a lot today. That's essentially what I'm talking about. And then we're going to talk about 3 simple metrics. You can do more than 3, and a lot of organizations have a lot of metrics they already use, but I'm going to talk about 3 that from our point of view are the essentials, and everything else beyond that is great, but not the essentials. Okay, so moving to this donor-centric model, just to kind of underscore what I said, but the focus on giving is now from the individual donor as the primary source of funding. So in other words, I'm going to ask you to stop looking at events and activities as the source. Doesn't mean we don't still track those, and we care, because it tells us a lot about donor behavior and what people are interested in and what they responded to. So there's still great reasons that we do that. But more importantly, we're going to be looking at the individual source, not the individual budget line item in this particular exercise. We're also going to talk a lot about a segmentation process, and a lot of you have probably done this at some level, but to me, this is the most important way that this stays manageable. And especially if you're a smaller shop and have a limited staff capacity, I'm going to show you a model of kind of what I would think of as the baseline of segmentation. It can be much larger and more sophisticated if you have a larger staff. But we're going to talk about a simple segmentation process that makes this donor-centric tracking as manageable as possible. And we're never going to lose sight of the individual donor and our ability as professionals to impact how they respond to us. So that's a key component in the relationship cycle. So what are some metrics that we do influence? So here's the 3 simple metrics, and you'll hear me repeat these a few times. But number 1, first and foremost, is retention. How many donors and how much of what they gave last year, and this can be fiscal year, calendar year, whatever makes sense for you, how much of that can you retain? That's, in our view, the most important metric that we start with. Your best customer is your current customer. We use that a lot in the business world, and I'd say in the nonprofit world, the same is true. You may disagree with me, but I'm not a big believer in donor fatigue. I don't think donors are tired. I think they're underwhelmed. And I think most of our donors don't, unless they have financial circumstances that prevent them from giving, which certainly happens, but most of them put their dollars somewhere else. It's not that they stop giving, it's that they're underwhelmed by how their experience is. And so those dollars just go to another organization. But retention to me is a reflection of a donor's engagement with us, their belief in our mission, and really have we done a good job as professionals of really bringing them in and showing them the impact of their gift. So that's my soapbox on retention. Then the second metric is growth. So looking at, again, at our current donors, We're going to look at how many of those donors could we actually challenge or more directly ask and consider larger gifts to us next year. So again, this is current donor base. How many can we retain? Are there some that we think we could grow into a larger gift? And then we look at new donors. So then we kind of talk about acquisition once we've looked at the retention and growth potential of our current customers. What do we need to do in terms of new donor strategy then to kind of make up that gap? And I'm going to show you a tool here in a little bit that you'll get a copy of and hopefully will be helpful to you to see that visually. So essentially the outcome of your work next year is the net result of these three metrics. Regardless of how large your budget is, how many activities you have, how many events you run, how many campaigns there are, at the end of the day, this is the net result of last year's results to this year's results. Very donor-centric in how we think about which sources came back, which sources maybe gave us more, what did we lose, and what did we have to make up in acquisition activities. Okay, so 4 quadrants of development, the way we like to kind of think about any development shop is there's essentially 4 essential pieces. And those very simply are that we have a case, we have a story that we tell, why we exist. We have prospects that fund us. We have leadership at some level in the organization. This could be staff and volunteer that kind of do the work. And then last is the plan. And so I learned that 25 years ago, and I still use it today, that is true in every development operation as the 4 foundational pieces. So I've said this 100 times or more to organizations. If it's not that complicated, really. It's just case, prospects, leadership, plan. And the plan is what we're addressing today. So too many times, I think organizations miss this piece. And again, they just look at their budget as kind of their plan and say, well, okay, we run this activity, we run that activity, we do this campaign, and that's our plan. And what I want to kind of just help you think about today is a different way to frame that plan that really pulls these things together and maybe helps you think about it a little differently.
Jennifer,
Yep.
real quick, what is the case in the?
You bet. Yeah. So case is your story. It's your mission. It's your why. It's basically why should a donor support your organization? Some people call it a case for support, comprehensive case. There's lots of ways to talk about it. But ideally, this is kind of a tangent, but ideally you have a well-drafted case that addresses all the programs that you have. And that's something that you would update every year and look at every year. Who are we serving? What are our numbers? What has changed perhaps year over year? And that becomes this kind of foundational document that really should populate all of your communication pieces, whether it's proposals or grants or even newsletters and things. Your case for why you exist. Okay, so who needs to be involved in a process like this and why? So first of all, your top leadership has to be somewhat engaged in the process. Now, for some of you that's easy. For some of you, you may say, oh, that's a challenge from day one. I've just seen it. If your CEO or executive director does not really believe and own this concept, it's very hard for you as a development person to execute. So he or she does not have to be heavily involved in creating it, but at least understanding it, owning it, and certainly buying into the strategy is an important piece. Clearly, your staff must execute, your development team. And if you have a team, multiple people on a development team, it's a great way to engage them in certain pieces and really help them, own it, understand it, and then certainly be more excited about, what their role is in the plan once they see the big picture. I'm a big fan of board development committees. So if you don't have a board development committee, this might be a good reason to begin to think about that. But the last one is the full board. The difference here from my experience is if you have a development committee, they can really be your champions to the entire board. You don't want to get your entire board necessarily in the weeds on this, unless you have a very small board, which is possible. But if you have a development committee that really understands it and gets the strategy, then they can be your best advocates at those larger board meetings when questions come up. Well, why are we doing it this way? Why did this budget go down or whatever? And it's really nice to have those advocates on the board that get it. So this is a great way to engage a small group of board members and those that you can really see being helpful to you in the execution even of some of the work. So those are the 4 kind of groups that I would say to engage at some level as you think about this process.
And one more point of clarification. When you say prospects, is that always referring to prospective donors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Any type. It could be individuals, corporations, foundations, but any source of philanthropy is how I would, yeah. Okay. So let's dig in a little bit into the components. And this is where we get a little tactical. So hang with me. But the key, I'm going to talk about the key components that I think would belong in any plan, regardless of the size of your organization. And then I'll have some others that I recommend that are more kind of optional or things you may want to consider. So first of all is that development mission, which is kind of that whole idea of your second customer. And we actually recommend that you craft a development mission statement. And so everybody can talk about their mission statement of the organization, hopefully, like that's the elevator speech that we learn. But what is your mission to your donors? And this is an exercise, we'll talk a little bit more about it, that just is great for your development staff if you have a team, or even to engage your CEO or executive director. So I'll come back to this in just a second and go a little bit deeper. The second component is you got to have some big goals. And I just group this into financial and non-financial. The financial ones are usually the ones everybody understands that are kind of the easier ones. Where are we going? What do we need to do in the next few years to grow? The non-financial is going to be more of how else do we need to improve in order to hit these growth, whatever the growth goals may be. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. Third is going to be a segmentation exercise that I'll walk you through at a pretty high level. Beyond that, some financial buildup of essentially how do we go from A to B to C over the next few years. Some kind of clarity of roles and responsibilities. Just a basic org chart can do the job with some high-level job descriptions. I think it's always good to revisit this periodically. And then last is some kind of a timeline or a calendar that just gives your team especially a visual. And I'll show you a very simple example of that as well. So we're going to go through each one of these very high level and then talk about some of the other options. So defining that second mission. So here's an example of what an organization might come up with. Connecting the hearts of our donors to the heart of our mission. So that's very high level. But what you want to get to here is what kind of experience do you want your donors to have with your organization? And many times it will go into this type of language around we want to, engage donors in meaningful and mission-centric ways. And there's lots of ways to go, but the process is honestly more important than the outcome here. Because the discussion that you can have with your development team, your executive team, even board members, is essentially what's the filter through which we want all of our development activity to come from. So if you say, in this example, we want to connect the hearts of our donors to the heart of our mission, and an opportunity comes up to do some kind of an event or a campaign or whatever, the question, it's fair then to say, like, how is that really connecting our donors to our mission? Do we really have an opportunity to do that? Or is this a fly-by-night, thing that really doesn't speak to what we have said we want to do? So this is just a way for your development team to really rally around the fact that this set of customers is who they serve every day. And how we connect them to our organization is our job. So it's a great exercise to just kind of create some dialogue with your teams about how your donors experience your organization. Okay, so digging into big goals then, as I said, financial and non-financial. So the kind of questions I would ask here on the financial, where do you need to be in 3 to 5 years? 3 to 5 years, I think, is the sweet spot for this planning. I'm working with an organization right now. We did a 3-year projection. They're at the end of their first year, and we're already kind of tweaking, years 2 and 3. So this is constantly going to be updated. And I think 3 years is a good minimum. 5 years is probably a maximum for this. There's just way too much beyond 5 years from a financial perspective that's hard to guess. So how much annual growth is reasonable? That's a really common question. And I hate to say it depends, but it does depend. I mean, if you're a $100,000 organization, your growth rate can be much larger than if you're a $50 million organization, right? So there is, got to be some consideration for where you are today versus what's reasonable over a 3 to 5 year period. Most people would say, 3 to 5% annually is reasonable for a mature development operation without any significant investments in staff or other resources that you'd want to put in place to grow more than that. So that's a benchmark for a mature development operation. But if you're a $250,000 young organization and you want to become $1 million, that's doable. That's doable over 3 to 5 years. And that's obviously an exponential amount of growth. So the biggest question, though, is why? Okay, and as a development person, you'll appreciate this, but why should a donor care? I mean, we always have to ask ourselves that tough question. So we don't want to grow for the sake of growing, right? We want to grow for the sake of mission. And what does that mean? So this is where the good stuff comes in. So yes, we want to grow by this many dollars. And we think annual growth could look like this, but why? How are we serving more people? Are we growing a footprint? Are we adding new programs? What are we doing? Because that becomes your story as a development person to help a donor understand where you're going and why their gift matters. So setting those big financial goals is kind of step one on the goal side. Then the non-financial, again, the question I like to pose is just what needs to improve. This could go a lot of directions, depending on the organization. Sometimes this is a staffing thing and we need to restructure our development team, or we need to add to our development team. Maybe it's board, maybe we got to get our board expectations clear and board members, on the same page with fundraising. Maybe it's culture. I worked with an organization recently that there was just a lot of kind of gaps between the program staff and the development staff, and a real lack of understanding between the two. And so one of their strategic goals was to, what we called cross the street on a regular basis and create a more intentional understanding between programs and development of how the organization was running. So that was a culture issue that they wanted to address. So this could be anything in your development shop that you really see as a 3 to 5 year kind of improvement that you think is critical. So those are the big goals. Next is segmentation. This is where I geek out a little bit because I love this. And I think it's so fun to see this when you actually get it on paper or in a spreadsheet. So here's the manageable piece of this is your top 100. And this applies if you're a small shop, and this applies if you're a large healthcare organization. You all know this, I'm sure, but a disproportionate amount of your revenue is going to come from these top 100 sources. In some case, this may be all of your revenue. For some organizations, it may be 80%. For most organizations, it's going to be north of 50%. That's just the way development works. And so when we think about what's manageable, I mean, I tell single shop or, EDs all the time, if they say, I'm by myself, I'm a founder, I don't have any staff, what can I do? I say, know your top 10. If you know your top 10 donors and you look at the percentage of revenue that comes from that group, you're probably going to be surprised. And if you can just make it your job to maintain and retain and even grow those relationships, that's going to be the most important work that you do. For most development shops, knowing your top 100 is doable. If you have any development staff, that's doable. And again, regardless of where they fall in the budget. So we got to get our mindset away from my event budget and my campaign budget and my annual fund budget and just look at individual sources. And in this case, I'm going to say individual people and corporations, because I believe that grants and foundations are a segment unto themselves. Just because of how differently they function, the cycles that take place. Sometimes it's not an every year gift. And I like to carve out foundations as it's a separate segment, just kind of a different approach, right? But with individuals and corporations, generally we're in dialogue and working with them in a more relational basis. Okay, so within that top 100 then, I like to segment your top 10, as I mentioned, your next 20, so that would account for 30, and then your next 70. So this again is another way to keep this manageable. And depending on the size of your team, you can assign these out. If you've got a large enough team, your director of development or chief development officer and your CEO probably are sharing your top 100 donors collectively in terms of relationships. But it's critical that you not only break down manageable segments, but then you're going to have clarity about who manages each relationship and really assigning what I would call a relationship manager to each one of these 100 sources, individuals and corporate. So then what do you do? Top 100. So that's what everybody, hopefully can do. That's pretty manageable. Then I would go to your next 200. Again, we're still just talking about individual and corporate, keeping those foundations as a separate group. And if you look at your percentage of revenue here with your top 300 now, I think you're going to find that, wow, that's for many organizations, that is the vast majority of our development budget. So we'll talk about why that's important. So grants and foundations then become their own segment, looking at that separately. And then you will have others. And again, larger shops are going to have more sophisticated segments here. There's no wrong answer to this question. Some other examples, though, might be gift in kind. If you have a large gift in kind shop, then it's great to look at that as a donor segment. You may have seasonal campaigns that you want to pull out. Everybody has giving days now and lots of different things that we run throughout the year. So looking at seasonal campaigns might be helpful to you. And then event activities. And I specifically use the word activities here because your sponsors, your larger call to action donors, perhaps back in our normal event days, they're going to fit in that top 300, right? So if you have a donor, just to give you an example, let's say you have a donor that sponsors a table at your annual event. They make an annual fund gift every year, and they give to a seasonal campaign. Just kind of, those are 3 buckets, right, in your budget. And collectively, if that donor is giving $5,000, let's say $3,000 to sponsor a table, $1,000 to your annual fund, $1,000 to a seasonal campaign. That's a $5,000 donor that's probably going to fit into our top 300 somewhere, right? So we want to pull out event sponsorship and all that kind of stuff because those folks are already accounted for in that top donor segment. But we may have activities like raffles, for example, or I have a client that gives a car away every year and it's $150,000 to their bottom line. They look at that as a separate activity that they monitor and manage. Those are $25 or $50 raffle tickets, right? So that's not in the same category as our top 300 donors. So if you've got activities like that you want to look at separately, great. That's all good information. Okay, so once we've identified our segments. We've got our top 100, hopefully our next 200, our grants, and then any others that make sense for you. We want to determine for each one of those, what % of the annual fundraising budget does that represent? So, and again, I want to just clarify, this is the budget that development controls. So if you're in an organization that has other sources of earned revenue in particular, you need to carve that out. So if you're a school and you have tuition, that tuition's another bucket, right? We're only talking about philanthropy. If you have thrift stores or other kind of social enterprise income, that carve that out. But that's not, even if that falls under you as a development director or something, we're only talking about the budget that really you control and that really is philanthropy. We're not buying stuff, that kind of thing. So look at what percentage of that philanthropy budget that each segment represents. And if you've never done this, this is a great exercise to share with your board, with your teams, you know, because most people are a little surprised that their top 10 or their top 100 or top 300 represents some significant portion of their overall philanthropy. And it just underscores why we do this. Because if we just retain those people, then sometimes 80–90% of our fundraising budget is met. If we just concentrate on those 100–200 sources. And then for each source, this is where, you know, we got to roll up our sleeves, but this is where kind of the art begins to come in, is can we retain that donor? Do we believe we can? Or could the gift grow? Or do we think it's going to go away, right? So that's where we go to retention, growth, and then the new donor conversation. So for every source, so if you can only do it for 10, do it for 10. If you can do it for 100, do it for 100. If you can do it for 300, do it for 300. Then capacity comes in here. This is what creates your starting point. And I'll show you a chart here in just a second that shows you what that might look like. But essentially, you know, if I can say to my team, we had, you know, 80% of our revenue last year came from 300 sources. So if we as a team focus on connecting and being in relationship with those 300 sources, that ought to be our first and best energy. Let's identify which ones we believe are growable, if that's a word. And what can we do perhaps to influence that? If there are some that we know are going away, they're moving or they're not interested in us, or, you know, we know that's a one-time gift, and we all got several of those this past year. So we got to make sure we filter those out. And then we look at our strategy for what kind of acquisition do we really need to do if we are focused on the retention and growth of this current donor base. Okay. So building a model is then another great tool and a great step that gets this very visual for your team. So this is something I just made up. Let's just say that you have your top 10 donors represent $225,000. And that's what you're trying to retain or grow for next year. So you can create a very simple gift chart, which I'm sure you've done before. For any of these segments, this is just for a top 10 example. And for every one of these boxes, I want to have at least one name of somebody that I believe can give that gift. What did they give last year? Is this a gift that we're retaining? Is this something we're growing? What are they interested in? Why do they care about us? And then what time of year do they typically give? So for your top 10, you know, this is a must, is understanding all of these things. So the example up here, let's say we've got a donor, Fred, that last year gave us $35,000. We know that he's really passionate about technology, and he normally gives to us in November. And we believe, for whatever reason, that this is growable and that we could go to Fred this year and maybe ask for a $50,000 gift. And so now we're on a trajectory of how do we plan for that? How do we engage Fred and get to a place that we feel like that's a good ask? So now we've created what I call a donor plan, or the beginning of a donor plan, that takes us from where Fred is today to where we'd like to get him, and how do we begin to engage Fred in maybe new and different ways that would get us to a place that we could actually ask him for that gift. So this is the model then that would, become the roadmap for whoever in your organization is engaged with these donors and begin to really talk about what are our next steps for each one. How do we get these donors to a place that we feel like we could ask? Okay, so that's one tool. I'm going to give you another one here in just a second, but the broad stroke financials then that you would think about in your strategic development plan would be this segmented revenue that we just talked about. So I know people use the term major gift in lots of different ways. So this is just one way that you might use it. So let's just say you call your top 100 your major gift category. Your next 200, you might call your mid-level gift category. Then your foundations, other, whatever those are for you. Number 2 then is going to be growth. So we have what are those segments and what was that revenue last year? Where do we think we can grow? Probably a trend line, like where has this been for the last 5 years? It's a great way to kind of analyze our retention and ask questions about, why we've lost donors, or if we saw growth, what did we do really well? And then we're going to project some outcomes. Okay, so this is the chart I want to spend a couple of minutes on. Don't get too hung up because you're going to get a copy of it. So I usually get a lot of questions on this, but this is just a very high level example in a smaller shop of what this might look like. So in this case, we just have our top 300 donors and we put an auction activity as an example of another segment. So you can see last year, we have top 10, next 20, third 70. So that's our top 100, and then our next 200. And we have the total of what those segments represented last year. So that's kind of step 1. The next step then is to look through these, talk about these donors and say, what can we retain? So in this example, what they have discovered is our top 10 donors we think are all retainable. And that would be a very individual conversation, but that probably means they know you, you know them, there's probably a relationship there, and that this is a conversation that is pretty easy to have. This is a donor that we have history with. So in each of the segments, you kind of do the same thing. And the further down you go, the more you're going to have to sort of guess. Of course, you're probably not going to go through 200 individual names that closely, but you can at least take a stab and put some numbers down that you think are realistic. So in the next 20, they've said, hey, there's 2 gifts here that we know are not coming back. So we need to pull those out, and that represents X amount of money. That leaves us with retaining Y. So that's where these numbers then come from. Okay, so that's part 2 is retention. Then you start asking about the growth trajectory. So in the top 10, this example says there's 6 of those donors that I think we could challenge to give more. And you're going to go donor by donor. So Fred Jones, we were challenging at $15,000 more. Maybe there's some that are $1,000 or $5,000, whatever. But this is the donor by donor exercise. Where could we take that donor if we did everything right based on what we know about him or her? Same thing with our next 20. Or third 70, et cetera. You can see in that next 200, if you do the math, that essentially represents 50 donors at $500. So maybe that's an appeal or a new giving handle that you're going to kind of test out next year and challenge folks to kind of rise to from 500 to 1,000, or something like from 1,000 to 1,500, something like that. So then you come up with those numbers. So then that gives you your delta. Right? So now we say, okay, if we retain this many, if we grow this many, and this is our kind of high level projection, now what do we have to do to acquire? And we're going to say, you know what, in our top 10, we're going to focus on retention, and growth. We're not going to go out looking for our next big, $10, $20, $30,000 donor. We're going to retain and work on the ones we have. In our next 20 segment, we're going to look for some folks that we can bump up, or that we can acquire new people at that $3,500 level in this case. et cetera, et cetera. So you go down the list and you go, okay, so now we've said out of last year's 300, we think we can retain 266 of those at the same level. We also want to work on growing 98 of them, and we need a strategy to find 34 new donors in this, at these levels, right? So then you total that up at the end, and you can see that from 300 last year to 300 this year, the kind of overall growth that you're projecting you can achieve with those activities. So this is where at the very beginning I talked about path to success and tracking progress. So what I recommend if you go through this kind of an exercise then is that this is just as important to tracking progress as your budget. So it's great if this campaign oversubscribed. It's okay if something came in under budget. All that really matters is what these sources are doing. And if their dollars went to a different budget line item this year for a variety of reasons, it doesn't really matter if the budget came out up or down somewhere, as long as we are retaining and taking care of these sources of philanthropy. Because again, this probably represents north of 70% of your philanthropy budget. Okay, so you're going to get a copy of this. I hope this is not super overwhelming. This is what I call the science behind, kind of what we do. And I can tell you that, board members and other people really love this if you get them involved, because it really shows them, a clear path to success. It also shows your team, and I love doing this in development team retreats, because it shows your team, like, where should you be spending your time? And so many times, development staff get really hung up on acquisition activities, which makes a lot of sense. We spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get more new donors, new campaigns, new ideas. When you say, if we're not taking care of our current donors and we're not spending time thinking about how to grow and retain and maintain what we've got, we're missing the boat, because we're gonna retain 266, we're gonna find 34. So if 2/3 of your time is on acquisition, it's a little upside down. So it's a great way for your team to kind of just underscore where time and attention should go.
Jennifer, can
you have a question, Chelsea?
Yeah, just a little bit more about like where the numbers come from, like how many are projections versus things you found, and then as you're doing some of these projections, on what basis would you decide to focus on retention or new growth? Those are kind of two separate questions, like where are the numbers coming from, and then how are you making those decisions?
Yep. So the only numbers that are hard and fast numbers is going to be last year's numbers, right? I mean, that's your history, and those are numbers that don't lie. Everything else is going to be somewhat projected and based on either really good hard and fast information that you have or guesses at some level. So I always say, like, if a donor has a history with you, I mean, if a donor's been giving you a similar gift for 3+ years, and you have a connection to that donor, like that donor knows who you are and they call you, and when they have a question, they don't just give online or send you a check in the mail, but there's some kind of connection, there's no reason to believe that you can't retain that donor. So, that history is always an important factor, and relationship is the other important factor. I always think gifts are risky if that donor has no personal connection with anybody in the organization. And that happens, right? I mean, there are donors that just mail that check for $10,000 every year, but they don't want to meet. They don't want to talk. Nobody has a relationship. So those exist in every organization. And I still think you can say, yeah, we think we can retain that, but you know what? We're not going to be shocked if that check doesn't come this year, because nobody's talking to that donor, So the more mystery there is behind a donor, I would say the less likely retention is. And this is where, I think we've all seen in the last 12 months, this is where the difference has been. If I can get a donor on the phone with me, and that's a pretty easy task, and I know they're going to take my call, and I know what they care about, and I know that they truly are passionate about what we do, retention ought to be easy breezy. If there's no relationship, or there's a lot of mystery behind why they give and all of that, then to me that's on the bubble. And then the ones that are gone are the ones that, if you got a COVID specific gift last year, that is not a retainable gift, right? If you got a third party gift, if you were the beneficiary of a golf tournament or some other, business, I do not put those in the retention category. If they come back, that's great, but you have so little control over what that may look like that it's, especially if it's a big number, then I just think it's kind of false reporting. Yeah, so it is a bit of it's just like budgeting, right? Our budgets are based on projections and some guesses and things that we really can't foresee, but we still have to project out, where we think we can go next year based on all that information. Did I answer all that question, Chelsea, or was there something else?
I've got a different question now too.
Okay. Yeah.
So curious what this might look like with a grassroots model, with like a lot of small recurring donors. Would this be a separate segment, especially if it doesn't divide smoothly into the next 200, etc.?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, again, I would, be careful about double counting. That would be my only kind of piece of advice. So if you've got a monthly donor program, or if you're a younger organization, you don't have a lot of history, this is going to be a little more complex, I guess, and challenging. So you might not have your top 100, top 300, you might say, let's do our top 50, because those are folks that we really can pull out into sort of a different level of giving and engagement. And then let's look at our monthly donors or some other segment as kind of another, you've got to do what makes sense for you. And there's no magic to 100 or 300. That's just what we've found to be the most palatable for most organizations. But if your donor base looks very different, then I would say at a minimum, you got to do your top 10. That's the only non-negotiable for me. Beyond that, make it your own, just make it donor-centric. Yeah.
Then a different question.
Yep.
Love to hear more about deepening engagement and getting donors to be volunteers or advocates and vice versa, but assuming this is a non-financial goal, like you talked about earlier. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just engaging donors in kind of a deeper way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, how do you do that during a pandemic? Great question. I've been shocked at how many donors are doing, Zoom meetings, and solicitations are happening and gifts are happening. So I wouldn't rule that out. But this goes back to where I mentioned the whole relationship manager process. So when you do your top 10, top 100, all of that, in a perfect world, there is one person in the organization who owns each of those relationships. And ideally, it's somebody that's already in relationship with them. If you're not, if this is a mystery donor that we're trying to learn about, at least their job is to try to demystify, the relationship. And for every donor, I would say, and we'll talk at the end about other metrics that you could have, like how many face-to-face interactions do you want to have a year with each of these donors? How many voice-to-voice? Those can be additional metrics that you may want to think about depending on your shop. But at a minimum, I want to learn, why do they give? What got them interested in us? What's the history if you don't know that already? Why do they keep giving? What is it about your mission that really is either personal to them, or like, what's their why, essentially? And to me, if you don't know the answers to those questions, that's where you start. And I have found that most donors are more than happy to have that conversation. People love to tell you their opinions and, talk about themselves usually. And I think sometimes if you frame it even as, we're just looking for feedback, we're trying to do a better job of getting donors information they care about, they want, they need? And would you give me even 10 minutes on the phone to just ask you a couple questions about why you support us? So that could be one way to get it going. If you know the donor, I mean, I think the more transparent, the better, always. And if a donor will have coffee with you, or when they will have coffee with you, you know, to sit down and say, you know, I've known you for a long time and you've been a supporter for a long time, but I don't know that I've ever really asked you, what is it about our mission that really is compelling for you? That's a great conversation. And I've watched EDs do that with longtime donors and come back from that meeting saying, I had no idea. Like I had no idea that this is what this donor was really passionate about. And what it does is then it gives you better intel, better ways to communicate. So in that example I just gave, a real story, this donor was really passionate about one specific piece of their mission. The ED really didn't know that. And so now when things come up on the program side that speak to that, she'll shoot that donor an email and say, I just wanted you to know that this just happened and I thought this would really interest you. And so it just gives you better ways to stay connected and to show donors things that are happening, because you're like, oh, this donor really wants to know more about this piece of our program. How can I make that happen? Like, you know, my job is to facilitate that donor's engagement with our mission. I can only really do that well if I really understand what matters to them. So that's, you know, there's nothing better than face-to-face, and, you know, hopefully later this year, we're all going to be, you know, feeling better doing that again. But in the meantime, voice-to-voice, I think is a great option, even just to get somebody on the phone. Okay, all right. I'm going to keep going. So very simple, you know, I mentioned just the roles and responsibilities. Again, you know, when I go into an organization and ask for their job descriptions, there's usually a little bit of a sheepish, you know, like, oh, these are a little outdated. You know, we don't really do that anymore or whatever. So it's just a great exercise, you know, to revisit these. And maybe there is a restructure as part of a strategic development plan that you want to propose. But if nothing else, just clarifying roles and responsibilities. If you have a development committee or want to form a development committee, like this is how I would frame their kind of dotted line to the director of development, and really being that kind of support, arms and legs, you know, really being your champion around strategy. So creating something like this, I think, is a great, easy tool. And then the last piece is some kind of timeline or calendar. And again, this is a great visual tool, even just for your team, but it also just helps you think through a little bit, because this is a very simple version. But for example, you know, how about the event review and next fiscal year planning? You know, like how many of us really take time after an event to sit down and do a thorough debrief and review? Usually we're on to the next thing, right? And we just kind of say, did we hit our budget? Did we not? And we keep going. So having some very intentional things, especially planning time on here. You know, event sponsor visits is the top line here. So when do we focus on those specific types of visits? You know, if that's your biggest fundraiser, it's probably a lot of your time. And it just kind of helps you see as a team, like how we're spreading some things out. We're not inundating people with 3 asks within, you know, 2 months or something. And how are we making sure that we're spending the right time on the right big activities? So this can just be a helpful planning tool for your team. Okay. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions right now, and then we're going to talk about some other kind of optional components that I would recommend, and then we'll kind of do some practical next steps.
We do have one question about how to determine a reasonable growth for certain donors. And you talked about like our forecasting and budgeting, but are there numbers or percentages you recommend, or, you know, if you really are just kind of checking it out?
Yeah.
This is the first.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So first of all, I think it's always got to be based on what the organization needs. So, you know, there's always a little bit of that, I don't know what the right phrases or the right word, but it's never, hey, let's go ask for more money because they can give us more money. And there's always a little bit of that, I think, uncomfortableness in our world. Like, hey, you drive a really expensive car, you can probably give us more money. That should never be our driver, right? It's our mission is growing, our programs are doing this, like this is what's happening in the life of the organization. And so if we're on a growth trajectory as an organization, then we should be able to say to a donor, you've been such a faithful donor at this level, and we're so grateful. Would you be open to me bringing you a proposal of what a specific gift would look like towards XYZ in our mission? So again, what do they care about? But it never can be like, I think you can give us more money, so I want to ask you for more money. So that's number one. Number two then is, you got to look at that individual donor. I mean, if they're giving you $10,000 a year and you say, man, like a $20,000 gift would be a huge gift for my organization, that's a lot of growth. But if you say that, I know that donor can do that. Like, I know they do that for other organizations. Like, I've got enough intel to know that that's not an ask that would be offensive or out of scope with their philanthropy. Then you gotta base it on that. I mean, you never want to have one donor giving 50% of your budget or something. Like, that's a dangerous place to be. So I would just say, what's the growth of the organization look like? And if you're saying we want to grow 20, 30% over the next 3 years, then that can be part of your why of why you're asking donors to kind of invest in a new way. And then it's also just, I interviewed a donor one time, I'll never forget this, for another organization. And he said, they don't ask me for enough money. And I was like, that's really good feedback. And I can change that, right? But it was, all they were doing was asking for an event sponsorship every year. And this was a man who was the CEO of a large organization who supported other organizations at a very high level. And they just had never approached him outside of their event strategy. And so they began a whole path of like, how do we really engage with him and his wife in this case and learn what they care about and why? And there's a great long story there that ended very well, but it just started with like, what do they care about? What else do they support? Is $25,000 sponsorship really, get them excited? And the answer was no. And over time, that's turned into a much larger program gift and a capital gift and some other things. So I hate to say that it depends on the donor, but especially in these like top 10 and next 20, like every donor is a project. And for some donors, $1,000 growth is a great win. For others, it could be 20,000 or 50,000 or more. And go back to that donor-centric mindset. It's always about, what do they care about? How do they engage with us? What matters to them? And how does that match up with where we're trying to go as an organization? And kind of making those two worlds come together.
We have a kind of a second question. If you're starting on if you're at a newer nonprofit or really just starting to build this, is there any things about like how to scale this down to somebody who doesn't have like that history or is kind of building this from scratch? Any thoughts on, kind of that 101 process? Any thoughts on what that might look like?
Yeah. So again, the non-negotiable is your top 10. That's where I would start. And even if you're really new and don't have even 3 years of history, I would say just look at last year. Look at last year and do everything in your power as you grow as an organization, even if you're very small, to let your top donors know how important they are to you, how you could not do your work without them, and that you are interested in long-term partnership. So, that is what too many large organizations don't do well, honestly. And so young organizations, I think, actually have a unique opportunity to be super personal and connected to those supporters. I think it's okay to tell donors, like, you are one of my top 10 donors. And I think donors appreciate that actually, and can almost feel not not like in a bad way, but in a positive way, like they need me, you know, and losing my gift would be tough for an organization. So I think it's a good thing, because sometimes donors think, oh, I give them 10,000, I'm sure I'm way small in their world. They may have no idea that their gift is one of your largest gifts. So I think that's a great conversation to have. Start with your top 10, and from day one, just say, I am going to pay attention to my top 10, my next 20, and as we grow, you know, keep adding segments. But even at those low levels, even if you're doing a monthly donor program or some other kind of campaign, I would just go hard on retention, retention, retention. Because just like in the for-profit world, I mean, you can do lots of analysis on the cost of a new customer, right? And development's no different. It's a lot more work, a lot more time, a lot more expensive to acquire new donors than it is to keep the ones you have. So I would double down on retention, especially if you're smaller and have fewer resources.
So then parallel to that, if people are haven't had donors before, right? If they've been in that startup world, any resources or tips for kind of that acquiring conversation? Can that be repurposed? The top 20 conversation you're having in the larger orgs?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I'm just going to be really honest and tell you that's not my expertise. You know, I've got friends in the digital fundraising space, and I refer them out sometimes to newer organizations that are really trying to build a donor base from scratch, because I think today that's where you start. Is certainly on the digital platform, but also your board. I mean, hopefully everybody's enlisting board members with the right mindset about their own philanthropy, but also introducing their networks. And I would just say, even as a young organization that's building a donor base, to set that tone with your board that, you know, I need your help, not only introducing folks that really care about us, but then kind of supporting me as a leader in the process of engaging them, you know, beyond just transactional methods. So we may want to get names in our database through digital strategies, which I think is important, but then the nurture process begins. And that's where limited resources become a real challenge. So, you know, my only kind of not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not concern, but the challenge with those broader strategies is you gotta keep it mission centric. You know, this is where events have failed us for years, and especially certain types of events. But don't acquire donors because they're getting something for their donation. You know, that you want to create a culture within your organization that people are invested in you long term. And this is not a one-time transactional, you're giving me a, you know, bottle of wine or something. You know, that's all fun and good, but, you know, I counseled an organization once that was doing a 5K race, and it had been this long standing event. And of course, over time, you know, revenue was dropping. But I was like, do you really think people are coming to this because they care about your mission? Because I can tell you as a former runner, and I am former, that I never went to a race because it was because the organization putting it on. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. You know, I was training, and when I was training for a, you know, marathon, I was hitting certain milestones, and I would go to whatever race was in town to do that. And the mission of the organization had nothing to do with my engagement. So that's an extreme example, but even in a building a donor base kind of method, I would rather have fewer donors that really care about what I do than to have a big database of people that don't really get it, and they just signed up because of something gimmicky. So building a donor base, I mean, mission centric, and maybe it goes a little slower because of that, but if you can work on retention, you know, from day one and see the value of that, you're going to spend less money and less time. If you're building a donor base of folks that are truly committed to your cause as opposed to just names. Yeah.
And I'm going to add some resources in the chat, but also if you have referrals or anything like that, we can share out afterwards too, because I think that just might be a good supplement.
Yeah, love that. Okay. All right, I'll keep going. So a few other things to consider. Some of these are pretty simple. Some may not be a fit, but other things that I've liked to do with plans in the past, sometimes an executive summary, very simple. I'll talk about each one of these briefly. That case for support, we mentioned that earlier, talk about that. Extraordinary resources that might be necessary for success, particularly if you're on a more aggressive growth path. Some more detailed financials, a SWOT is one of my favorite things to do, and then additional metrics. So here's what a couple of those high level might look like. So the executive summary might be just an overview, just more narrative here instead of just the big goals and all of that, but like what happened last year, what contributed to our success or our challenges, what do we really see as the big opportunities ahead of us in the coming year. You reference each component in the plan, and maybe you introduce a theme. A lot of organizations like to do this. This could be a great way to just put the plan in front of your board, your full board, without getting into the weeds of the whole thing. So usually that's why I would recommend an executive summary, is if you want to share this with a slightly broader audience without going into all the detail. So that can be helpful. The case for support, we talked about this earlier, but this is essentially like, what do we do? Who do we serve? Why does it matter? Biggest question, why does it matter? And why should people care? And this is always, the question we have to ask ourselves over and over and over. What problem are we solving in our community? Every nonprofit is there to solve a problem. And donors like to solve problems. That's why most donors want to support. So to just go back and articulate those things every year and refresh that with your team, with your leadership, with your development staff, with your board, this is a very healthy exercise. And again, this should become or can become then just that foundational piece that you pull everything from. So if you're lucky enough to have a dedicated grant writer, he or she, all of their program narrative can come from this and be, copied and pasted into their applications. You can use this for all of your communication pieces throughout the year and not feel like you're having to write it from scratch every time. What are some extraordinary resources? This might be new staff. If you're on a growth track, you may say, once we hit this level, we're going to want to add this position. Work that into your budget and explain why. Maybe it's that development committee we talked about. Maybe that's a new resource that you want to describe and enlist. A lot of folks, want a better CRM. And, I don't believe CRMs raise money, but using one really well can be super helpful in analyzing your data and really understanding your donors better. So if you aren't working with a CRM that's doing good stuff for you right now, then sometimes that's an investment that you want to think about. So it's crazy to think we might want to increase our event budget, but there could be lots of budgets that individual small budgets that you say we need to spend more here. And so for the startup, back to that earlier question, this may be an acquisition investment. You may say we need to spend in this first year or second year in order to acquire, really begin building a donor base. And so that may be a short-term investment. And then time, this is a question we get a lot. Especially with CEOs, what percentage of my time should I be spending on development? And I tell CEOs, again, you probably know your top 10, you're probably already in relationship with them. If not, that's where you start. I don't like CEOs generally, assuming there's a development staff person, to have more than about 25 relationships that he or she truly owns. It really depends on the CEO. Some are going to be super fundraising, minded and focused and want to engage. Some you're going to struggle, to get them to go on a donor visit. So you know them better than anybody. But I do like CEOs to carry a portfolio of donors, and that could be anywhere from, 10 to 20 ideally. And a lot of times it's going to be some of your biggest and best donors that want to see him or her. So that's the investment of time, I would say, from a CEO, is managing some top relationships and letting your development CDO or development director, whoever, kind of manage up to let you know when they need you in a particular donor interaction. So those are some extraordinary resources you might want to address depending on where you are. So some more detailed financials, again, depending on sophistication of the organization, you can certainly take this much deeper if you want to, or get your accounting team involved. But for each activity, remember, we're going to talk about retention and attrition. We're going to talk about growth. We're going to talk about acquisition. And you can do that at a much more detailed level if you want to go, into the weeds on financials. What I showed you before, I think, is adequate for the vast majority of organizations. And I discourage you from getting too caught up in that, because it can take you down a rabbit hole sometimes that isn't meaningful. So make sure that you're sticking at a level that is still meaningful to how you hit your goals. SWOTs, I'm sure you've all done SWOTs before. I know they're old, but I think they're tried and true, and still can be a very healthy exercise. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats of your development operation. This is a great way to engage your staff if you have multiple staff, and in your development committee. Sometimes this is a great way to start the conversation with the development committee. And it'll be interesting. Sometimes you learn things from their perspective that you didn't even consider, of how they, view the development side of the organization. Obviously, being candid and real here is really important. And then considering the impact to each of your activities. So, we learned a lot about, threats in 2020. And hopefully, what we talked through today helps mitigate some of that risk. But, it's important to look at each of your development activities, whether it's events or campaigns or whatever, and say, based on these threats or these opportunities, what does that really mean for how we should think differently about how we're running that activity, or how much time and energy we're putting into something. So the critical metrics we've already talked about, but more importantly, it's just getting used to the fact that if you don't have metrics today, just introducing the concept of metrics at some level. We talked a little bit about face-to-face versus voice-to-voice. There's a lot of ways to do this, and it can get a little messy. So again, I like to stay super high level. Recently, I've been working with some organizations that we're just talking about meaningful touches, because it's really hard to do face-to-face, with a lot of donors right now. And, what do you define as meaningful? That can be, kind of hard, but essentially, are we having personal direct reach out to the donors that we are responsible for multiple times a year? And until we get back to normal face-to-face, I think it's fine to adjust your definitions. The baseline is retention, growth, and new donors, of course, and I would say no more than 5. It just gets a little complicated, I think, when there's too many things you're trying to measure, and people get a little overwhelmed by it. At the end of the day, I tell development teams all the time, you may be responsible for a piece of your budget or a number of donors, or you may have very specific kind of marching orders. But at the end of the day, all that really matters is that we as a team hit our overall target, whatever that is. And really embracing that concept that we're all on the same team. And if one person, if the special event person is just suffering right now because we can't do those things, but this person is killing it over here in this area that we didn't plan for, let's celebrate, where we are succeeding, and say, how do we mitigate this other area where it's not working right now? And if the bottom line number is where we need it to be, that is our team's measure of success. So what I counsel against a lot is this kind of siloed mentality, where it's like, hey, this is my donor. They give to my thing that I do, and so I don't want you talking to them. Or, I don't want to bring up that donor in the context of growth, because that's part of my responsibility, where again, donor-centric, what's important and good for the donor is good for the organization. And so if they shift from this budget line item to that budget line item, but they're giving more to the organization, that's a win. And we have to make sure that we're celebrating what's good for the organization, and not siloing our metrics and our people in a way that they feel too like they're hoarding donors. Okay, and of course everything needs to be measurable. I know that sounds obvious, but it's funny to me how I see metrics sometimes that are very nebulous, and you're thinking, can you really measure that at the end of the month? Do you really know? So make sure that it's things that are simple. Okay, so last piece here, and then we'll have open it up for any more final questions. So where to begin? A lot of information, hopefully hasn't been too overwhelming, but somebody says, where do I start? This is what I would say. First of all, you got to answer the question, what is most important this year? If you're still in the planning process for this year. Who needs to be involved with this? It doesn't have to be everybody. This can be very small if you need it to be. And then do you have time or urgency or budget constraints? So we talked about this a lot last year when people were kind of rebudgeting, reforecasting, and dealing with very kind of short-term, urgent, needs. So I would still say weigh all of those things. Do you need a 3 to 5 year plan, or do you just need to say, let's do a really simple version of this for 2021 that allows us to get from where we are today to where we need to be? So take all that into consideration first. Don't overwhelm yourself. Some other next steps, talking about that second mission. If that's a good conversation based on your organization right now, that's a great, healthy conversation. You can do it on a Zoom meeting, get somebody on a whiteboard, throwing up words and what matters. And that's a good kind of easy entry-level exercise. Talking about those big goals, just where do we need to be, and whether it's this year, 3 years, 5 years, and why. Remember that financial objective. Yes, we want to double our size, but why? In order to do what? What's the mission impact? The next step, another thing, is begin that segmentation. And if you have the capacity to pull last year's history, that's where you start. Just look at that last year, top 100. It's a good exercise to begin. And then always ask the question, over and over and over, how important is retention? And if that's, if you have one takeaway today, honestly, I hope that's it. I hope that just by going back and looking at the history, if you can pull that data of your top 100 from last year and saying, how much revenue does that represent of my total philanthropy budget? Then ask yourself the question, how important is it to retain those donors, or as many of those donors as I can? I think most people have a little bit of an aha if they haven't done that, to say, wow, that is a huge chunk of what I'm responsible for. And if I can just think about how to retain and maintain those relationships, that's the vast majority of my work for next year. Okay, so those are some suggestions on how you might get started, but happy to field any other questions.
I also just want to open this up if anybody wants to come off mute or has any questions specific to your org, please feel free. This is definitely your opportunity if you have specific. I know we also asked a lot of questions, put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's great. So. That's great. Well, and you guys, I will get the slides to Chelsea, so she'll be sending those out. And if you don't have access to my email, you can go to our website, admissionadvancement.com, and you can reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to chat with you even individually. And I'm in Dallas, but we have a couple of team members that are based in Austin, and happy to visit with you about any specific challenges or questions going on with your organization.
Can you guys hear me okay? My name is Sweeney here in Austin with Tessa and Good Work Austin. I have a question, but I realize that it's at 1, and I was also looking to wrap this up. That last slide, it kind of caught my attention about this. This is kind of like the focus of a 1-year plan versus a large scope for, just kind of taking a baby step. I'm almost thinking, I'm kind of wrapping my mind around it, and I would love to actually have a conversation with you about it. Would that be more appropriate to just shoot you an email and kind of have us expand on it? Because I feel like first of all, heard most of this. I had a multitask for part of it, but this was really awesome information. But that caught my attention for like a small, newer organization, because sometimes the bigger picture, it's almost easier. I feel like we had a leadership team meeting for organization. It was easier to like kind of think about big picture, but really like kind of seeing that slide reminded me, like, I almost wish when we had that session in the fall or like last December that we just focused on 2021.
Yeah.
And just kind of getting, I don't know, just some more pointers or your thoughts on what that would look like or would be helpful.
Yeah. Feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to, just talk with you separately. I mean, from just a big picture, for everybody's benefit, I would say that any larger strategic plan should have kind of then those milestones along the way. So essentially, you would create a 1-year plan within the context of your 3 to 5 years. And as I mentioned at the beginning, then you're going to tweak it every year. So you're essentially, if you want to start with the 1-year plan, because that's the most urgent, time sensitive, and critical for your organization right now, that's a pretty, doable kind of baby step. And that would even give you some context for if we really wanted to think this through for what 3 to 5 years would look like. You've already done some of the legwork and understand the components. But creating that 1-year plan as a first step is certainly a doable exercise, especially if that's what meets your needs right now.
Yeah, I think also for us, we were on a trajectory that completely took a sidetrack because of 2020.
Sure.
And that's sort of, there's sort of like, it's almost like this other organization that's evolved within our organization, and putting both of those in alignment is an interesting. Yeah. Absolutely. Like doing kind of like all these analysis is almost like we're trying to do it twice.
Yeah, no question. Yeah. And last year in particular, I mean, I felt like everybody, I mean, me included, right? I mean, even in our business, that it was like, okay, well, everything that we had in the works for 2020, we just need to start over. And so it really became like, how do we redefine? Yes, for most organizations, they had these gala budgets and these, other things that just weren't going to happen. And so instead of saying, let's plan 3 to 5 years, are you kidding? Like, it was just, let's do a 6-month plan or a 9-month plan or whatever. And some of you may still be feeling that. And if you are, then I would say stay in that mode until you feel like you've lifted from the short term, pivoting, if you will, overused word, but and you're ready to get back into the long-term trajectory. So I would say, yeah, stay there if that's where you are as an organization before you tackle what 3 years looks like.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And just to reiterate, we're going to send the slides, the recording, at the resources shared in the chat. And then I'm also going to send a survey for feedback. So if you have any additional questions or anything you want us to be thinking about, I always say, like, I make it a point to make sure that I'm at all the member meetups because I want to hear what other kinds of questions we're having. And so even today it was like, oh, there's a lot of great topics we could dive into. So we're here for that kind of feedback.
Good.
Awesome. Well, with that, then I think we're going to wrap up and just want to say again, thank you to Jennifer and to Mission Advancement for supporting us with this way. This has been an invaluable, seeing in the chat how much of a great resource this is to frame this year and what kind of support this has been. So we're really grateful that you took the time to be with us and that all of you joined us today to be in this space as well. I will be here if you need anything. I'll hang out, but otherwise we'll see you all at the next one.
Thanks so much.